the complications are like mitomycin C, but less severe. Plaque brachytherapy. It is used for control of broad or microscopic residual tumors. When the histopathologically the base is positive, diffuse base positivity, at that time we use plaque brachytherapy. Sometimes it is used as a primary treatment. This is the outcome of plaque brachytherapy. Recurrence rate for OSSM is 50 to 52%, but with the protocol-based technique, the recurrence rate can be limited to less than 5%. But the prognosis is worse in imicloprid or adenoid or spindle cell variants and in immunocompromised patients. This is my case. This is a very advanced OSSN presented to me with large conjunctival lesion, intralesional vascularity, middle road vessel was positive, and no enlarged lymph node. And I followed the surgical protocol, excision with 4 mm pre-margin, alcoholic ileectomy, double of cryosedation, and amniotic membrane graft. And this is the outcome. And there is no history of recurrence till now. Squamous cell carcinoma of the conjunctiva. And this is also the same type of case, but it is a diffuse variant, and I treated it with also with surgical excision and with follow the protocol, and this is the outcome. So, in conclusion, I want to say that if we get any conjunctival lesion, we have to evaluate it with patients, and we have to see whether there is keratin present, whether the growth is increasing in size, and it has intrinsic vascularity and feeder vessel and growth Bengal positivity. We have to examine the nose also, and then we have to go with the treatment. So protocol-based treatment is better prognosis, and counseling and follow-up very crucial. Thank you for patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Millie. So we have a few questions. So I would like the panelists and Dr. Millie. So the first question is, what precaution we should take during base cryo, and what is the upper limit?
What is that?
What precaution we should take during cryo, and what is the upper limit for the cryo?
I didn't get the question.
Temperature and duration. How much? Duration.
Temperature is minus 60, and then we have to put it in the ice ball form. Then we defrost it.
And spontaneous defrost. Spontaneous defrost.
Yes.
Spontaneous defrosting.
Yes. Yes.
Another question from Dr. Puneet Jain is, what would be the site of intralesional interferon in cases of diffuse OSSN when we cannot see any tumor-free area? So you have a diffuse OSSN, you don't see a tumor-free area. Where would you inject the interferon?
I don't have any experience about intralesional interferon. I think that Santosh Sonabhasar can answer this, because interferon is not available. I use drop interferon eye drop, but I don't have any experience in using intralesional.
Definitely available in our country, but we started just now, last 6 months. But no vast experience is there.
So Dr. Sinha,
Santosh Anwar Fairuz can answer. They have the experiences. Dr. Fairuz can answer.
Fairuz and Santosh sir can answer for this.
Yeah, Dr. Santosh can go ahead. Sir? Well, in diffuse OSSN, when you're suspecting, although there is a diffuse involvement of the bulbar conjunctiva or pharyngeal conjunctiva, there might be a small area where actually you can find a free space. It could be closer to the caruncle or lateral canthus or anywhere where you can actually relatively less involved area of the conjunctiva can be chosen to inject and balloon the conjunctiva in diffuse involvement of conjunctival OSSM.
Thank you, Fairuz.
Dr. Santosh?
In one journal, it's seen that interferon should be injected in diffuse cases in multiple areas, localized cases, a single injection.
Dr. Vikas, would you want to comment on this?
See, I don't think there will be many cases where you have a situation where you can't even find even a small area which is clear, as you just said. So, I mean, there is usually we find there is some sort of area which is clear. Maybe it is in the fornices or maybe it is in the palpebral conjunctiva somewhere. You just have to go there and you just have to inject and it just inflates like a balloon. The conjunctiva gets lifted off. So the drug spreads. And I don't think there will be many situations like what Dr. Punita said. But hypothetically, let us assume that there is a situation that everything is involved. Then probably one can maybe do a cryo-assisted injection. That could be one option where you have your cryo probe along with it. You inject and from where you pass the needle, cryo that area.
I want to repeat that focal relation injection is only one area, but multifocal diseases injection is distributed over all of the involved areas.
Yes, that I agree. That it should be given in multiple areas, but from the clear areas, the adjacent areas of the wherever you don't see the evident tumor is there. So it is better to give in multiple areas.
As a preoperative OCT, would it help just to see the areas where it is more versus less and give it in relatively lesser area?
Yeah, Dr. Vikas, so when we talk about anterior segment OCT, we may not be able to cover the entire 360-degree.
Correct.
Even, the periphery of the bulbar conjunctiva, most often we are not able to cover in anterior segment OCT. Yeah, so mostly it is a clinical judgment that we take whenever we take a call on conservative, topical or intralesional. Until and unless it is right there on the limbus, involving the cornea, and then anterior segment OCT plays a major role, yes.
Great, thank you. So we will move on to the next talk. And I have this task of introducing Dr. Santosh. I think we need an entire webinar just to introduce him because of his achievements. I'll keep it very short. Dr. Santosh has been a teacher to everybody who's actually giving a talk in this symposium, either directly or indirectly. And he is one of the most sought after teachers that we see in most of the conferences. His sessions are usually jam-packed, whether it is talking to the postgraduates or teaching the fellows, and he is very, very involved. So, and he's going to talk to us about which conjunctival pigmented lesion would you worry about. So over to you, Dr. Santosh.
Thank you, Vikas. Am I audible? Is my screen seen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Millie, for your wonderful organization, and I thank Dr. Ghulam Haider and Dr. Kadir for their involvement in this webinar. I will be talking about which conjunctival tumors do we really worry about. So which are the good, which are the bad, and which are the ugly. Now, if I show you these three gentlemen, which is of course from a very classic movie, which one of this is good, which one of this is bad, and which one of this is ugly? You can't tell by face sometimes, right? So I have to label them. Now we know that which one is good, which one is bad, and which one is ugly. But when we face a situation like this in the clinic, where it's a land of, too many patients at the same time who look very, very similar. Everybody looks like a pterygium, everybody looks like having a nevus or a primary acquired melanosis. Now, how to tell which one is good, which one is bad, and which one is ugly? So we have to identify the correct diagnosis in a very short time, which is available to us with a patient, maybe 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes. So I'm going to deal with some of the common conjunctival melanocytic tumors and classify them as which one is good, which one is bad, and which one is ugly, and which one to worry about. Let's talk about complexion-associated melanosis of CAM, primary acquired melanosis, nevus, and melanoma. I will not be talking about secondary acquired melanosis, which is not so common. It is also called actinic melanosis, where patients who are exposed to actinic radiation, such as sunlight, UV radiation, can get hyperplasia of pigment in the conjunctiva, which is bilateral. Secondary melanosis can also occur in patients who use certain cosmetics around the eye, such as mascara. It's called mascaroma. In fact, when it accumulates conjunctivally within the stroma subconjunctivally, and it can even present like a plaque-like or a mass-like lesion. They could be drug-induced with adrenochrome containing anti-glaucoma medication such as epinephrine used earlier. So anything can cause conjunctival pigmentation secondarily. Some of the drug toxicities, then we have scleral melanocytosis, which is not really conjunctival, and some melanoma mascara such as a pigmented foreign body, etc. That I'm not going to talk about. Now, how common are conjunctival pigmented lesions? In Asia, story is a little different. We don't have it as common as that is seen in the West. But in the West, in the largest series, you can see that conjunctival pigmented lesions constituted 50% of conjunctival tumors, of all conjunctival tumors. When you look at it carefully, about half of them were nevi, unfortunately, and only about a quarter of them were melanomas. So 12% is the overall number of melanomas that we see in all conjunctival lesions, conjunctival tumors. Primary acquired melanosis constitutes an equal proportion, and nevus double, about 25%. So nevi are very important because they're more common. Even in Asia, nevi are more common. Primary acquired melanosis is much less common, and melanoma, of course, is quite uncommon. Are we worried about complexion-associated melanosis or racial melanosis? Not at all. Primary acquired melanosis, very little. Nevus, no. And melanoma, we worry a lot. Let's talk about racial melanosis or complexion-associated melanosis, also called CAM. Now, how does it look? It is typically bilateral and mostly symmetrical. It may not be a mirror image of one eye over the other, but it is grossly symmetrical. If you see the lesion in the upper bulbar conjunctiva like that, and in the other eye, it would possibly be like that. But it is nearly symmetrical. The extent and severity would be symmetrical. That's a very striking feature of complexion-associated melanosis. And it shows this cobblestone kind of large globules of pigmentation, and you see microfolds within the area that is involved. On slit lamp evaluation, it may appear a little thickened as compared to the normal conjunctiva, but that is okay. It does not have abnormal lumps and bumps. It is not irregular thickening, but the pigmented area will show some uniform thickening. And you may even find some fine pigment dust in the peripheral cornea, which is also a feature of it. You should not worry that, well, okay, there is corneal extension. It is not really corneal extension. It is just the pigmentation extending along the limbal structures right into the cornea. Sometimes it may have ponychial extension, but what is very, very uncommon is nasal or palpebral conjunctival involvement. Now, how do you manage this? Of course, by observation. You don't have to do anything at all if you are quite sure that it is complexion-associated melanosis. But if a patient wants cosmesis, if it's a young individual who wants a white eye, then there are two options. One is to resect the conjunctiva that is involved and obviously replace it with amniotic membrane or a conjunctival graft. Or you can do heavy cryotherapy. You can do peritomy at the limbus and cryo from the back. And there is resorption of the pigment over time. Cryo is effective. There is mitomycin, but I don't think it is too ethical to give mitomycin in a normal eye just for pigmentation. And there are laser therapies as well that implant the pigment. So the pigmentation can be gotten rid of to show that the patient wants cosmesis. Now, when should you be worried about what looks like long complexion-associated melanosis? When it is very classically unilateral. Look at this. This this is so dark, whereas the other eye is absolutely normal. In this situation, whenever you find gross asymmetry between the eyes, of course there is some pigmentation, but you can't call it by any means symmetric. So in this situation, although the right eye may look like complexion associated melanosis, it is actually primary acquired melanosis that we are dealing with. So there might be certain overlap, especially in India and Bangladesh, where patients do have a pigmented conjunctiva. There is bound to be some overlap between CAM and PAM, and we have to be very careful about that. So this is primary acquired melanosis. So whenever there is asymmetry, you have to rule out primary acquired melanosis. That is a guiding principle. And whenever there is asymmetry, you should look at, even otherwise, you should look at the entire conjunctiva, not just the vulvar conjunctiva. Vulvar conjunctiva is actually less than 50% of the actual extent of conjunctiva. Unless you have seen the palpebral and the fornical conjunctiva, your examination is not complete. So what about primary acquired melanosis? It is generally seen in middle-aged individuals, more common in Caucasians, typically unilateral and flat. There are no cysts, and it is a high risk for melanoma. Flat, but of course we have seen, at least in Asian Indians, that the inward portion of the conjunctiva may be slightly thick. How is it different from a complexion-associated melanosis? Whereas complexion-associated melanosis has cobblestone kind of architecture, this is more of dusty or peppery. It has this small dots of pigmentation like you see on slit lamp at a higher magnification, which may not be confluent at all. So it is a kind of pepper dusted appearance, and it does not have microfilms. That's very classic peppery appearance of primary acquired melanosis. One more classic example of primary acquired melanosis, where you see a very nice peppery architecture. Now, what is the risk of primary acquired melanosis? These are two studies done decades apart. This was the famous AFRP study, which we always used to quote. Primary acquired melanosis with atypia has nearly 50% chance of turning malignant. That is what we were taught when we were fellows, and we were very worried about primary acquired melanosis with atypia. Now things have changed. At least in the last 10 years, after this large series got published, we are worried about primary acquired melanosis with atypia. We are not as worried as we were 15 years ago. So it's just 13%, which is a good risk, but it is not something that would make you very alarmed. 13% is a okay risk to have. Overall, 9% without atypia, 0%. Without atypia is absolutely innocuous, but with atypia is about 13% chance of turning into melanoma. And how do we know whether it is atypia or not? Well, biopsy can tell you, but are there any clinical indicators whether a particular band that you're looking at has atypia or not, or has a higher chance of turning into melanoma? The same article that I was quoting about, there was a multivariate analysis which shows that if BAM has a involvement of more than 2 clock hours, then there's a higher chance of it turning into a melanoma. So if you have a BAM with just 1 clock hour involvement, then possibly you just simply watch. These are small pigments which we may even miss in our situation because our eyes are more pigmented than the Caucasian eyes. But if you do find a BAM which is about 1 clock hour or 2 clock hour, you simply watch like this. You simply watch, you know nothing about it, right? But if it is as extensive as this and has this nice peppery architecture, then you are bound to consider that this may have a BAM because this is a higher risk. More clock hours is a higher risk. Fornical involvement is a higher risk. So more than 2 clock hours, fornical involvement and palpebral conjunctival involvement all have higher risk. So when you talk about BAM, don't just talk about its involvement in the vulvar conjunctiva. You have to flip the lid and look for palpebral conjunctival involvement. Sorry, I got disconnected. Can I complete it?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. I think there's a power issue here in Hyderabad today. Okay. So I was here, I suppose. Did you hear me when I talked about this?
No, sir.
Okay. I was talking about risk factors for PAM, more than 2 clock hours, involvement of the palpebral conjunctiva, involvement of the caruncle and plica, involvement of the phonacial conjunctiva. So you have to explore the conjunctiva and look at the entire extent of conjunctiva before you conclude whether a given set of PAM is important or not. So this is an example of a patient where phonacial conjunctiva is involved. When you look at more medially, you see a nice large melanoma. And this is a phonacial PAM again, and that nodule is a melanoma. So PAM with atypia is dangerous. But when you look at the converse data, we talked about PAM causing melanoma. But when you look at 100 cases of melanoma, how many are caused by PAM? Very striking, 75%. Only a few. De novo is only 20%, pre-existing nevus 5%. So the most important cause for melanoma still remains PAM, but not all PAM can cause melanoma. The lesser frequency of PAM causing melanoma in the SHIELD series is possibly because now we identify very small lesions. Earlier, people would ignore patches of conjunctival pigmentation. Now, since we are aware that conjunctival pigmentation is dangerous, we have been observing more and more of them. Possibly that is the reason why we have smaller lesions that are included in the series, too many of them. That is the reason why possibly the risk of melanoma seems low. What about nevus? Nevi are not to be worried about. Like these 4 patients have pigmented conjunctival lesions which are by birth and thereabout. All of them have a nevus. All of them look little similar, but there are certain features that you need to kind of elicit in a patient with a nevus. Nevi have interpalpebral location. Nevi have variable pigmentation. You can see tan to dark brown in the same lesion. Nevi stop short at the limbus. They hardly have corneal epithelial invasion, but they are very close to the limbus. They don't have episcleral fixation. When you move the lesion on top of the sclera, they should move. Nevi don't have intrinsic vascularity, but they should have a feeder blood vessel. Books write that blood vessels, episcleral blood vessels are indicative of melanoma and not a nevus. But you can see in every patient that I have shown you here, all 4 of them have a feeder vessel. So that's not contraindication to the diagnosis of nevus. But if a patient has a lot of intrinsic blood vessels, then that may be a melanoma that you're dealing with. Most important of course, is the microcyst and macrocyst. Nevi have microcyst and nevi have macrocyst. Nevi are spongy, whereas melanoma is solid. Like this patient with a non-pigmented conjunctival nevus, which looks little fleshy, has a feeder vessel, and it is amelanotic. You see some intrinsic vascularity as well, but a typical microcyst. So this is a amelanotic nevus. Now, when you look at a large series, you find that 15% of the nevi can be amelanotic, and about 65% have cysts. Now, remember, these cysts were diagnosed in this series by slit lamp evaluation. But when you add on OCT, then the sensitivity of picking cysts very highly increases. So now if you use OCT, possibly you will find cysts in almost every patient with a nevus, almost 100%. So with slit lamp, you are able to identify about 65% cysts. But are cysts pathognomonic of a nevus? No. Cysts can be found in lymphangiectasia, mucoepiderma, squamous cell carcinoma, etc. So when you look at a cyst, you should not be fooled about the cyst because cysts can occur in other lesions as well, and you should be aware of that. So where all are nevi located? Bulbar conjunctiva, caruncle, plica, very common. But when you find a pigmented lesion in the fornix, tarsus, and cornea, you should not be fooled by its appearance. It could be a melanoma that you're dealing with. And nevi are very close to limbus. Mean distance from the limbus is 0 millimeter. That means are very, very close to the limbus. Now, when a nevus transforms into a melanoma, it changes its character. From this cystic, flat, placoid lesion, it is amelanotic, of course, here. It transforms to a vascular, fleshy lesion. Cyst, and that's a fleshy lesion, and that is transformation into a melanoma. I had this patient as a teenager. I was following him up, but when he became about 25, 26, he started developing this particular lesion which he came with. You see this dark lesion arising from a pre-existing what looks like nevus and a fleshy component and subconjunctival hemorrhage. When you do imaging here, you can see that the component which has cyst still is a nevus and component which is solid is a melanoma, and that is the transition zone where a nevus is transforming into a melanoma. So this is a very clear indication that UBM or ASOCT can help you diagnose a nevus from a melanoma with histopathological correlation. Going on to melanoma. So melanoma is something that we need to worry about, and I already mentioned that PAM is the most common cause. Melanoma have a high chance of metastasis and death. Most important diagnostic feature of melanoma is that they are elevated, nodular, fleshy, and this hungry tumor attracts blood vessels from all sides, from the level of the episclera, sclera, conjunctiva. Blood vessels come to feed it, and you can see very severe intrinsic vascularity, and because of that high vascularity, part of which is more vascularized, looks very fleshy. So whenever you see a conjunctival lesion like this, like a nevus, you may think you have to look at rest of the conjunctiva. So this is actually a multifocal melanoma. Now, how do you manage it? Management is, as Millie pointed out in OSSN, surgery is the treatment of choice, but it is no-touch surgery where the edges of the conjunctiva are very well demarked, 4 to 5 millimeter clear margins are harvested, but surgical success is extremely good unless the tumor is infiltrating. This is one example where multiple surgeries had been done earlier with not much of histopathology that the patient brought, but it was a melanoma confirmed and he had multifocal recurrence. Either you enucleate it or do something surgically. Unfortunately, this patient had scleral invasion as well. So here we do this surgery where surgery is straightforward, but you have to take certain precautions. Right. That's the marking 4 millimeter clinically clear margin all around. Initially, we are excising the melanoma component and then going on to PAM. It's a combination of monopolar and bipolar radiofrequency electrode. The muscle is involved here, the lateral rectus muscle is involved as you see here. So part of the muscle has to be sacrificed and then the PAM is excised. Phoneal conjunctiva is very carefully inspected for patches of pigmentation. Alcohol is applied to the corneal epithelium and then alcohol assisted keratoepithelectomy is performed. Muscle is reinserted back after a bit of recession, and then plaque is applied to the bed. We already know that the patient has scleral involvement, so plaque is applied to one part of the bed, then it is reversed, so it's a kind of rotational plaque to cover the entire bed of the tuba, and the plaque is removed and the ocular surface is reconstructed with AMG after cryoing the edges of excision. That's how the patient looks on at the end of surgery with a symplectron ring. And after a few weeks, this is the appearance. Melanoma is gone and he continues to remain stable after about 6 to 8 months of follow-up. So what is new about melanoma is the biomarker. We have to identify biomarkers if we really want to bring up the prognosis in terms of regional lymph node metastasis and systemic metastasis. We have identified the rotational spectrum of melanoma now, and for each of these there is an approved drug. Unfortunately, drugs are very expensive and these drugs have been approved for use for metastasis. Like pembrolizumab has been approved for metastasis, but you find that these drugs work very well even in conjunctival lesions or epibulbar lesions. You can see that the tumor is much reduced after use of pembrolizumab. And nivolumab has also been approved, and you can see smaller series have now started appearing in the literature where these drugs have been used for conjunctival melanomas. We had a patient where the patient was on nivolumab for regional lymph node metastasis, and his conjunctival lesions actually started regressing, and after about 3 months of treatment, his conjunctival lesions have spontaneously gone. So there is an option for using this targeted therapy for conjunctival melanoma, especially to treat orbital invasion, lymph node invasion, and also prevent metastasis if you have a patient with high risk. So which conjunctival pigmented lesion would you worry about? Would you worry about this? Possibly not. He has this cobblestone pigmentation bilateral symmetrical. This is complexion associated or racial melanosis. What about this? This is unilateral, has peppery pigmentation. This is primary acquired melanosis. This mildly pigmented lesion in the interpalpebral bulbar conjunctiva in a child, nevus for sure. Whereas this you would definitely worry about because this is very aggressive looking, fleshy conjunctival lesion, which is a conjunctival melanoma. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for the excellent talk. I think there are two similar questions. That is, how to differentiate amelanotic from melanotic, and can amelanotic tumors be dark?
Amelanotic tumors by definition can't be dark. They lack pigmentation. They look fleshy. Depending on the basic complexion of the patient, they may appear in a very light pigmented patient, very fair individual, it may look fleshy. Whereas in a slightly darker individual, it may have a very light tan appearance, but it is not typically pigmented. That is how you often diagnose an amelanotic lesion. So amelanotic by definition are not supposed to be dark.
How to differentiate amelanotic from melanotic?
By color.
One question I have.
Yes.
One question I have.
Yes, sir.
Primary acquired melanosis.
Yes, sir.
Atypia or without atypia. Can we clinically diagnose by high resolution microscope or confocal microscope? Clinically.
Clinically, it will not be diagnosed by OCT or microscope at this point in time. There is no evidence to say that clinically we can diagnose it. So what we have done is to correlate clinical features based on histopathology. You start excising this condition.
Incisional biopsy first.
Correct.
Incisional biopsy first.
Yeah, start correlating, and that is how Shields had devised this risk algorithm, where if the lesion is more than 2 clock hours in extent, circumferential extent, it has a higher tendency of being PAM. So larger lesions definitely have atypical features, and also if the lesion is involving the plica, caruncle, phonesis, and the palpebral and tarsal conjunctiva. So location is important and the extent is important. If both are present, then there is a higher chance of atypical lesion. In our experience, what I have observed is that if the lesion has some thickness on slit lamp evaluation and has corneal epithelial invasion, then it is a higher chance of having PAM with atypical. So all these factors combined, you come to a clinical judgment in a given patient whether it would have a higher chance of being PAM with atypical when you excise it. Excision is very simple, straightforward, does not leave any complications. So the purpose of excision is only to diagnose.
Question is that number two question is that, as for example, like limbal involvement more than 6 o'clock hours, we have to remove more than 6 o'clock hours limbal stem cell after removal of the primary acquired melanosis or melanoma. We have to need stem cell graft or not?
Well, generally, fortunately, PAM does not occur right at the limbus. It is away from the limbus, so you don't have to disturb limbal stem cells so much often. But if you have a chance to remove 6 clock hours of the limbus, one option is to do just the amniotic membrane, because the risk of having limbal stem cell deficiency is less in PAM or pigmented lesions, because these are not tumors arising from the limbal stem cells. Whereas with OSSN, which is a tumor arising from the limbal stem cell, the chance of limbal stem cell deficiency is very high. So there is a solution. The surgery that is devised by Dr. Sangwan, primary simple limbal epithelial transplantation, is a very good option. If you have a chance to disturb a lot of limbus more than 6 clock hours, you can simply harvest about 2 millimeter of limbus from the opposite eye or from the normal area of the same eye, make it into small bits and lay over an amniotic membrane, which is called simple limbal epithelial transplantation, which works very well. So you don't really risk causing limbal stem cell deficiency.
Thank you. There's another question. How do you deal with recurrent conjunctival melanoma, especially if it involves the orbit or the nasolacrimal duct?
Okay. So the moment melanoma leaves the ocular surface or the sclera and gets into the orbit, then obviously the only treatment for melanoma of that sort is orbital excision. If it has gone into the nasolacrimal duct, then you have to do a radical excision, not just of the orbit, but also you have to make en bloc excision of the bone around the nasolacrimal duct, the bony component of the NAD, right up to the inferior tablet. Sometimes it is endoscopic guided, as was being presented in one of the other webinars, where they used endoscope to excise the nasal NLD component. But you can do it externally also by lateral rhinotomy approach combined with orbital excitation. So you have to be very careful with those because they have a high chance of having regional lymph node and systemic metastasis.
Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Kadir is back. I think his internet connection has been restored. So, I would request him to continue with this presentation before we move on to Faroz's talk. Yeah, Dr. Mehboob, we will start.
Okay, may I audible? May I audible?
Audible.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to conclude the rest of my presentation. This is the slides of preoperative and postoperative photographs of my cases of eyelid malignation. What is the new modality treatment for eyelid malignancies? We already discussed about cryotherapy as primary therapy, but cryotherapy may be used as adjunct therapy for the locally aggressive sebaceous gland carcinoma applied to the surgical margins or in areas of bastard disease, so where clear surgical margins are not achieved during surgery. Multimodal treatment for aggressive sebaceous gland carcinoma includes tumor reduction followed by surgical excision with or without cryotherapy and then radiation therapy. Targeted therapy for advanced basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. For basal cell carcinoma, capsule disponibly 150 ml. Up to the dedication of the lesion is very much effective for basal cell carcinoma, but that is the reason for this, because most of the patients we can use intravenous cetuximab with oral allogeneic as targeted therapy for melanoma. TVEC drugs, BRAF inhibitors, MEK inhibitors, and PD-1 inhibitors can be used for melanoma. Local chemotherapy includes 5% of 5-fluorouracil lotion for basal cell carcinoma, 5% imiquimod lotion for squamous cell carcinoma and basal cell carcinoma, 1.5 million interlesional interferon alpha 2b for non-melanotic cancers like basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma, and tazarotene gel may be used in basal cell carcinoma cases. Electrochemotherapy is the treatment for eyelid malignancy. Locally advanced or recurrent basal cell carcinoma can be treated by electrochemotherapy. Bleomycin are using as chemotherapeutic agents, and bleomycin injection. Bleomycin can be injected into the tumor cell or intravenously. After that, electric pulse is applied by a needle electors after 1 or 2 minutes of injection. Another treatment model is high dosage brachytherapy and electronic safe brachytherapy. Now, take-home message: sebaceous gland carcinoma is highest in occurrence in Bangladesh. Gold standard treatment is the surgical excision with microscopic clear margins. Metastasis was found in our cases. That was aggressive sebaceous gland carcinoma. Fusion section is the preferred option in our respect. Newer molecular treatment has recently evolved the excitation and high dose radiation therapy. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Mehboob. So far, there are no questions for you. So, if there are any questions,
One question.
Yeah.
One question I have.
Sure, sir.
One question I have. Dr. Mehboob, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
BCC is very common in Western countries, like European countries. And severe carcinoma is more common in this subcontinent.
Yes.
Not BCC is more common. Just equal to severe carcinoma and BCC is equal to. Why severe carcinoma more in this subcontinent? This question not to you also. Shanta Shanavan, Papyrus, you can answer this question. My question.
The exact cause I don't know. The exact reason I don't know. It may be genetical issue. It may be a food behavior. I think.
Shanta Shanavan.
Yeah, why is it more common is because, in non-pigmented individuals who are exposed to actinic radiation, basal cell carcinoma is more common. Like Australia, this is very high. So it is a relative incidence of tumors. We are protected by our pigments, so we have less of basal cell carcinoma, whereas we have more of sebaceous gland carcinoma. But just because our numbers of basal cell carcinoma are far less than what is seen in the Caucasian population, sebaceous gland carcinoma is disproportionately high. It is not that we have too many sebaceous gland carcinoma, we have relatively more of those, agree, but we have much less basal cell carcinoma. So the proportion when you convert it into percentages appears very high in favor of sebaceous gland carcinoma. Numbers are not too high. Per 10,000 or per million population, when you calculate, numbers are not. Whereas we have much lesser basal cell carcinoma.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Feroz P. Manjandagda. She is the director of Oro Specialty Eye Care Center in Bangalore. She is also a consultant at Prabha Eye Clinic and Research Center. She did a fellowship at L.V. Prasad Eye Institute under Dr. Santosh, and also did a fellowship with Dr. Carol and Jerry Shields at the Wills Eye Institute, Philadelphia, USA. Dr. Feroz, who is going to talk to us about systemic versus intraarterial chemotherapy. So over to you, Feroz.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope it is visible and I'm audible.
Yes.
All right, yeah. Good evening, everyone, and namaste. I congratulate the organizers in conceptualizing this webinar, United We Care, a symbol of friendship and unity among physicians across the borders. Congratulations. I thank Dr. Milli, Dr. Ghulam Haider and team for inviting me for this kind invitation, and it is a pleasure to be here. And hi to all my friends in Bangladesh. I'm going to take you through a very major topic in retinoblastoma, the systemic versus intra-arterial chemotherapy. I have no financial disclosures or interests, and I would like to acknowledge my patients, parents, my mentors, and the team of retinoblastoma that I work with, who made this journey extremely wonderful for me. So retinoblastoma, as in any other cancer, has certain goals in the management, and primarily being life salvage. And being an eye cancer, definitely as ocular oncologists and ophthalmologists, we are concerned about eye salvage and vision salvage as well. So chemotherapy in retinoblastoma as a primary management are two types. Systemic chemotherapy, which has been there, it is a time-tested treatment modality, and intra-arterial chemotherapy, a recently introduced and very popular method of chemotherapy. So the basic difference between both is systemic chemotherapy, as you all know, it's given intravenous. There is a systemic drug concentration which would be achieved, a higher drug concentration, in order to achieve adequate concentration inside the eye to treat the tumor. So leading to systemic toxicity. Well, it is time tested, as I told you, but making it it is inexpensive and making it much available, especially in the low and middle income countries like us. Intra-arterial chemotherapy, on the other side, is a direct targeted treatment where chemotherapeutic agents are injected through the ophthalmic artery to reach the tumor directly. So this doesn't have much of systemic toxicity, but it can have increased local drug concentration and local ocular toxicity. And making it technically and being a technically difficult procedure, it is expensive and it requires an expertise in the cath lab for this particular treatment. So both of them has pros and cons, and it does have definite indications. I'm going to take you through. So it was Dr. Karl Kupfer back in 1953 who actually introduced systemic chemotherapy along with radiation in the treatment of retinoblastoma. But it was in 1990 that systemic chemotherapy revolutionized the management of retinoblastoma with the introduction of the VEC protocol. I'm not going into the dosage, and this has been widely accepted and approved worldwide as the primary management of retinoblastoma. Now, going about the outcome of systemic chemotherapy, well, it is excellent in Group A, Group B, and Group C, as you can see here, where you kind of salvage the eyes almost 100% and salvage the vision to some extent in these eyes. So this was a child with bilateral retinoblastoma who presented at 4 months of age. When the child presented, there was no following and fixation in both the eyes. As you can see here, after completion of treatment, the tumor has completely regressed in both the eyes, even sparing the fovea in the better eye, finally leading into fixation and following and relatively good vision in both the eyes. But Group D tumors has always been challenging in the management of retinoblastoma, as in this case over here, you can see large stool tumors with lots of diffuse seeding. In fact, this child was also treated with systemic chemotherapy, and as you can see here, after 6 cycles of systemic chemotherapy and adjuvant intravitreal chemotherapy to treat the diffuse vitreous seeds, we could salvage this eye, which was the better eye in bilateral retinoblastoma, and also salvage vision to some extent. Now, does systemic chemotherapy help in salvaging eyes in Group B? Yes, in some certain percentage of eyes, we do try systemic chemotherapy to salvage the eye, but definitely not the vision. This was a child presenting at 3 months of age with a large tumor, intraocular tumor, who received systemic chemotherapy, and this is how she responded with systemic chemotherapy and focal consolidation with few sessions of DTT, and this is how she is at 4 years of age with an eye salvage, although there is no vision. So systemic chemotherapy helps in eye salvage, vision salvage, but there is certain other situation of indication of systemic chemotherapy. As in this case, this child presented with preseptal cellulitis, aseptic cellulitis, and as you can see here in the ultrasound, which is playing over here, it's a large tumor occupying the globe, which has undergone necrosis. There is a component of necrosis in this intraocular tumor. There, definitely you're going to go for an enucleation, but it's quite difficult at this point of time for the child to undergo enucleation with this severe inflammation. So we do give systemic chemotherapy because you have a waiting time. You don't want the tumor to grow or progress, and there is a possibility of systemic micrometastasis in these children with a large tumor occupying the globe. And of course, the most important thing when you advise enucleation to the parents, they need a little bit of time to adjust to the traumatic news that you tell them their enucleation. So it's basically a time buying with the parents, and also trying to save the life of the child, where definitely the child is going to go for enucleation. But we have to make sure once you start systemic chemotherapy, where you have planned an enucleation, it is extremely necessary to complete 6 cycles of chemotherapy after enucleation and completion of, in order to complete the treatment. So systemic chemotherapy has, apart from eye salvage and vision salvage, it also has indication in life salvage. Plays a major role in life salvage in retinoblastoma, which is a cancer, and it can be lethal. So whenever there is high-risk features for systemic metastasis with optic nerve involvement and many other features, adjuvant chemotherapy post-enucleation plays a major role in improving the survival and reducing the mortality. So there are certain high-risk features. I'm sure most of you are aware of it. I'm not going into the detail. So whenever there is a high-risk feature which is being detected is knowledge, particularly after enucleation, systemic chemotherapy again plays a role. So post-enucleation retinoblastoma, which involves a high rate of systemic metastasis and mortalities, systemic chemotherapy plays again a major role in this particular situation. So this is a series that I worked up as a research with Dr. Sandhu Shonava, my mentor, on orbital retinoblastoma. So we found that the multimodal treatment protocol, intensive multimodal treatment protocol, apart from systemic chemotherapy, where enucleation and radiation is also done in these patients, the survival rate is much higher. So this is how the child with orbital retinoblastoma looks like after 1 year of follow-up, completing the treatment, including high-dose systemic chemotherapy. So systemic chemotherapy helps in eye salvage, vision salvage, and life salvage, which is primarily very, very important for retinoblastoma. Intra-arterial chemotherapy, let us look into it. So definitely it has a major role in eye salvage, especially in advanced intraocular retinoblastoma, as in group D eyes when compared to systemic chemotherapy. I'm going to take you through the outcome of intra-arterial chemotherapy and to a certain extent vision salvage. So this was put forward by Dr. Akihiro Kaneko, a respectable ocular oncologist from Japan, and was popularized by Dr. David Abramson from New York, USA. So the drugs that we use in intra-arterial chemotherapy is different from systemic chemotherapy. Melphalan, topotecan, and carboplatin are the drugs that we use as a triple drug, a double drug, or a single drug therapy, depending upon the situation of the tumor and the choice of the treating ocular oncologist. So this is a large tumor, as you can see here. A group D eyes, which is being treated with 4 sessions of intra-arterial chemotherapy. You can see the tumor is completely regressed, the unilateral eye. Another tumor where you have an intranasal peripheral lesion in a unilateral eye, completely regressed, and I'm going to show you how the eye and vision has been saved with 3 sessions of intra-arterial chemotherapy over here. And this is the corresponding spectral domain OCT of these children, where the fovea is also quite intact. So it is safe. It is, if it is given safely with adequate dose and in the hand of an expert. So we did evaluate and compare systemic chemotherapy versus intra-arterial chemotherapy in a few of our research work. So the main advantage of intra-arterial chemotherapy in retinoblastoma is, seen in group D eyes when you compare it with systemic chemotherapy. 47% of eye salvage with systemic chemotherapy versus 85% to 94% eye salvage with intra-arterial chemotherapy. Then intra-arterial chemotherapy does give excellent intraocular results in intraocular tumors, but then there are associated minor and major vision-threatening complications as compared to systemic chemotherapy. So this is a case where the tumor is group C, way away from the fovea and macula, but after intra-arterial chemotherapy, as you can see here, there is retinoporoidal atrophy, and in fact, the macula looks very, very unhealthy with branched vascular occlusion. So this possibly would have been a good seeing eye, but intra-arterial chemotherapy had its complication. Yet another case where you can see diffuse retinoporoidal atrophy in a case of unilateral retinoblastoma, as you can see here, and this is the OCT finding where the entire macula and the retina is completely destroyed due to the local toxicity of intra-arterial chemotherapy. So is certain situation where you can have optic nerve atrophy optic neuritis leading to atrophy, and also central retinal artery occlusion. So these things has to be kept in mind when you are, planning to give intraarterial chemotherapy. So there are certain indications and contraindication strictly. The contraindications are, it is absolutely contraindicated in advanced intraocular retinoblastoma where there is clinical high-risk features, which there is a chance of systemic metastasis. In bilateral IAC, where you have a better eye and you want to salvage the vision in that better eye, so it is good to avoid bilateral IAC, where you want to give vision to the child for a better life. Whenever there is always an MRI is done before you plan to do an IAC in order to evaluate the optic nerve. So in the presence of an optic nerve involvement, it's an absolute contraindication. And as in the case of secondary therapy of IAC, if the tumor is treatable with cryo, laser, or intravitreal, well, we would prefer that rather than a secondary IAC. So there is always a gray zone in every treatment modality. So group E retinoblastoma is a gray zone in intraarterial chemotherapy. So this was the review that we had recently published in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, where, as you can see here, the group D and E eyes, it is not as effective in group E eyes as compared to the group D eyes. So there are certain strength, weaknesses, and opportunity and threats which we did evaluate in the same review. And this was a SWOT analysis that we have done. So when you choose intraarterial chemotherapy, it is very, very important to know the weaknesses more than the strengths, so that it helps in salvaging the life of these children and they're not at risk of high mortality. So to conclude, I would show this slide over here: systemic chemotherapy versus intraarterial chemotherapy. Both are effective. It's excellent. Systemic chemotherapy has the advantage of achieving all the three goals, including life salvage, eye salvage, and vision salvage to a certain extent, and intraarterial chemotherapy, eye salvage. So systemic chemotherapy is indicated in intraocular RV, in advanced disease, and even in orbital RV, where intraarterial chemotherapy is indicated only in intraocular retinoblastoma. Even if there is a minor suspicion of clinical features suspecting systemic micrometastasis, it has to be avoided. Now, when we talk about Bangladesh or India or any low and middle income countries, it has to be affordable, it has to be accessible. So, systemic chemotherapy is advantageous in that situation. So, I hope I have made justice to the talk in the limited time available. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I am willing to take questions now. And this is my retinoblastoma baby.
Thank you, Fairuz, for an excellent talk. Any questions for Fairuz from the panelists?
I have the question. Dr. Fairuz,
Yes, Dr. Haider.
have you faced any complications of intraarterial chemotherapy, like secondary arterial occlusion, ophthalmic arterial occlusion, retinal ischemia, spasm, like that?
Yes, Dr. Haider, all the slides that I showed you in my presentation are the cases that I have treated. So I have taken you through diffuse retinochoroidal atrophy. I have seen vitreous hemorrhage, central retinal artery occlusion, and even in optic atrophy. So there are reported cases of even third nerve palsies and complete nerve palsies, which has been reported in intraarterial chemotherapy. So we have taken all these things and we have published in our recent review of intraarterial chemotherapy in IGO, where we have spoken about everything, like what are the common, and it's basically a review from all the literature regarding complication. And yes, I have seen. These are all the complications that I have seen, which I showed in my slides.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Fairuz, one question.
Yes, Dr. Mehta.
Can you talk about situations where you would like to combine intraarterial chemotherapy with systemic chemotherapy?
Yes, so there is something called a bridge chemotherapy, where initially you start with systemic chemotherapy in children, 3 3 to 4 cycles, and then you switch to intraarterial chemotherapy. And this is usually done in bilateral retinoblastoma, where you start with systemic chemotherapy. You want to try to salvage the eye and the vision in the better eye, and then you give intraarterial chemotherapy as well later. And then, of course, as a secondary therapy, IAC, where all the previous treatment, including systemic chemotherapy and focal consolidation, has failed, IAC can be used as a secondary therapy.
Maybe can it be tried in situations where it's a unilateral group E maybe, but the parents are absolutely unwilling for enucleation, and so kind of procedure where to buy time maybe and kind of maybe show the parents that you are trying your best sometimes, and just an eye salvage procedure with systemic combined with IAC. Have you tried that? In a unilateral situation.
Yes, so there are many patients in group E. So my experience in intraarterial chemotherapy, I would say 98% of my patients in China undergoes intraarterial chemotherapy, whereas 98% of my patients in India undergoes systemic chemotherapy. So it's very, very difficult to convince the parents, even in unilateral retinoblastoma, for enucleation. So regionally, yes, I have used intraarterial chemotherapy even in group E eyes. With the hope to see a good response, one from my side, and also to buy time for the parents. Yes, and if at all there is a clinical high risk feature, I wouldn't shy away from starting systemic chemotherapy initially, and then bridge it with IAC if it's a positive result after that.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, we'll move to the next talk by Dr. Santosh again, and he's going to talk to us about uveal tumors.
Because I'll be talking about uveal melanoma as such. So why should we know about uveal melanoma? Because it's the most common primary intraocular malignancy in adults. If you talk about most common intraocular malignancy in adults, that will be metastasis. But most common primary intraocular malignancy is melanoma. It's a deadly tumor with up to 50% mortality, and it often presents to an ophthalmologist first because these patients have visual symptoms, and it is curable, at least the ocular component is curable if it is detected early. Uveal melanoma can occur as iris melanoma, trabecular meshwork melanoma, iridotrabeculociliary or iridociliary melanoma, ciliary body melanoma, ciliochoroidal melanoma, or choroidal melanoma. So there are various mixtures in the manifestation of uveal melanoma. This is an example of a patient, a 30-year-old male who presented with having undergone trabeculectomy earlier with uncontrolled intraocular pressure. He was referred to a glaucoma specialist for a shunt procedure. Now, when you look at the angle, you see a trabecular meshwork, trabeculectomy ostium there with a very curious round PI, and you find that there is correctopia and ectropia uveae, which prompted the glaucoma specialist to diagnose this as ICA syndrome. But then there is something pigmented which is at the back behind the iris, and through the PI you see that pigmented tissue. Otherwise, you're supposed to see either a good red glow or the lens capsule, which you're not seeing here. You're seeing a pigmented lesion which is behind the iris, and there is neovascularization of the iris. So whenever a young individual has unilateral secondary glaucoma for which the etiology is not known, then you have to do anterior segment imaging. Otherwise, you may miss a lingering melanoma. This patient was, of course, enucleated, and you see that this is the scleral flap, and under the scleral flap, you see melanoma, and in the bleb also you see melanoma. So this particular melanoma has been made extraocular by this trabeculectomy. So that is how these patients often present, because this tumor is not very clearly visible. If it's behind the iris, it can often be missed. Now, there are various types of melanoma that can occur in the iris. Based on morphology, it can be called feathery, it can be called nodular or tapioca melanoma, which can easily be diagnosed on imaging by thickening of the iris and nodular excrescences that you see as opposed to a granulomatous uveitis. Then there is ring melanoma of the iris and trabecular meshwork, which is more than 180 degrees called ring melanoma, which can cause secondary glaucoma. And based on the criteria, A to F criteria, where you can differentiate a nevus from a melanoma, if a patient is aged less than 40, if there are normal blood vessels, if there are inferior glaucomas involved, if the lesion is diffuse, if there is ectopia on UVA and feathery margin, HR is of course Hazard's ratio, that will tell you that a particular pigmented iris lesion is a melanoma. Now, as opposed to case that I showed you first, this is also a 30-ish gentleman who comes to you with a secondary glaucoma, unilateral, and he has a pigmented lesion in the inferior aspect of the iris with heterochromia, but his pupil is perfectly round and central. He has high pressures, no NPI, and a pigmented lesion. So when the pupil is not distorted and there is a pigmented lesion, it's unlikely to be a melanoma, and you should consider alternative diagnosis such as melanocytoma. And this patient did have a melanocytoma of the iris, and because it releases so much of pigmentation which blocks the trabecular meshwork, these patients tend to have melanocytoma lytic glaucoma, and that can be treated with either a shunt or trabeculectomy. But of course, you have to confirm the diagnosis before you venture on to do a filtering procedure. That's again a typical melanocytoma. You should not be fooled by the color of the lesion or the size of the lesion, but if it's dark charcoal black like this with pigment clumps which are dusting the iris surface and the inferior angle, but with the pupil round, nice and central and no NPI, most likely you are dealing with a nevus or a melanocytoma. Melanocytoma is also magnocellular nevus. One more patient where there's a dark pigmented lesion on the iris. This was a nevus. Whereas these two are melanomas. You see that about 3 to 4 clock hours of the periphery of the iris is involved, and the pupil is zipped towards the lesion. Distortion of the pupil. This is a large nodular lesion, but with neovascularization of the iris and distortion of the pupil. These two are melanomas. So melanomas can be circumscribed or diffuse, and depending on that, you can plan the management of iris melanoma. If it is circumscribed like this, then you simply have to do a iridectomy, center iridectomy with clear margins, and that will get rid of the lesion. But if it's larger than this and involving the periphery, then you should do plaque brachytherapy, which is the treatment of choice. If it's a much diffuse lesion or say a ring melanoma of the iris and trabecular meshwork, then enucleation may be a better option. Tumors such as this, where a lesion is about 3 clock hours, but there is diffuse involvement of the iris periphery and the trabecular meshwork, this needed enucleation. Now going on to ciliary body melanoma, which is often not diagnosed until late because it is something that is not seen at all. And unfortunately, it does not even produce complications such as glaucoma early on in the course of the disease. So it is often missed. It is not seen and it does not produce complication. It does not produce subretinal fluid unless it is very large. It does not cause visual symptom. It lies quietly in the periphery. But what should not be missed by a general ophthalmologist is a blood vessel. This is called sentinel sign. If you have a patient with a large dilated single or 2 episcleral blood vessel, which is reaching just short of the limbus, then you should definitely do a very good indirect ophthalmoscopy with indentation. And if you don't find anything, you should definitely do anterior segment, ciliary body imaging by using UBM or an immersion B scan. If you do a routine B scan, you're going to miss it because then you will not be able to diagnose it. So if this is the most important indicator. If you find a dilated large episcleral blood vessel, that is an indicator of a ciliary body tumor unless you are proven otherwise. Now this patient has a tumor which was just seen on a routine evaluation. He did not have any signs of melanoma, but when he was asked to look on an extreme side and the slit lamp was focused, you were able to find a solid lesion which is peeking behind the iris. Some patients actually come with extraocular extension. So ciliary body melanoma can be hidden. This patient had multifocal extraocular extension with conjunctival melanoma deposits when he came because of a ciliary body lesion now involving the iris. Because these patients need extended enucleation. One more patient with extraocular extension. There's a ciliary body lesion now involving the iris and trabecular meshwork with extraocular extension. What do you do for ciliary body melanoma? Of course, if it's less than 3 clock hours, then you can do local resection, which works very well. Little more than that, you can do plaque brachytherapy, proton beam radiation, or enucleation. Sometimes vague presentations like this can fool you. This patient presented with the iris pigment epithelial cyst. Of course, it is an iris pigment epithelial cyst, but any patient who has a cyst, you're supposed to do imaging, not without a reason, only to diagnose a solid component, because cysts can be secondary. Like in this patient, cysts were secondary, and 3 cysts, 1 here, 2 there, and there was a solid component which was melanoma. Following plaque brachytherapy, the cyst has collapsed and the tumor size from 3.48 millimeter has come down to 1.89 millimeters. It's still very early, about 6 months follow. So you should never be fooled with the iris pigment epithelial cyst, and you should still do imaging in every patient with the iris pigment epithelial cyst. This is the close-up of the cyst. Now this is a patient where there is a necrotic ciliary body melanoma with an angle breakthrough with hyphema following plaque brachytherapy. So plaque works very well even in patients who have a ciliary body melanoma with iris breakthrough or angle breakthrough. But for extensive lesions, you have to do enucleation, and when enucleation is performed, sometimes you realize that the tumor was not as large as you had thought it is, and possibly you could have salvaged this with plaque brachytherapy. This is one such example where the patient was also keen on enucleation, and we were also keen on doing enucleation because it appeared large on everything else. But when you do enucleation, you realize that okay, possibly this was a case for plaque brachytherapy. Plaque can be used, and if it fails, then there is always a chance of doing enucleation. Now, how do you differentiate a nevus from a melanoma? This is a patient with a choroidal nevus, and a pigmented choroidal lesion with a lot of drusen on its surface and retinal pigment epithelial changes is a nevus generally. And when you do imaging in a nevus OCT, you find that you have a plaque or a slightly elevated nodular mass in the choroid compressing the choriocapillaries. So that's a very typical feature. This is a nevus, and you can see in imaging, if you don't find much of leak or no leak in a nevus, whereas in a melanoma there would be leak and double circulation. When it breaks through the Brooks membrane and presents like a color button-like kind of lesion, the diagnosis is very obvious. This is a choroidal melanoma. Now, there are confounding situations like this. This is a very small lesion, less than 2.5 millimeter in diameter, but with a lot of orange pigment. In a surgeon, this surgeon had gastroenterologist, had difficulty in operating, so he came and he was diagnosed to have a small melanoma, but he did not believe the diagnosis, how small a melanoma can be, 2.5 millimeter. He went around and somebody told him that it is a nevus, and he refused to believe that it's melanoma. He did not come back for 6 months. 6 months later, he had a much larger lesion. So obviously it's grown and it is a melanoma. So how could we tell such a small lesion to be a melanoma and not a nevus? How can you take the risk of telling a patient and even going ahead with plaque brachytherapy without even doing a biopsy, when there are clinical features that will tell you tell a nevus from a melanoma? These are elicited by Dr. Shields, and there is a newer one variant now. But this is very nice to remember to find small ocular melanoma using helpful hints, Daly's and mnemonic. Thickness or P is more than 2 millimeter. Fluid is SRF, subretinal fluid. Symptoms of metamorphopsia or visual loss, micropsia, etc. Presence of orange pigmentation. Margin less than 3 millimeter from the optic disc of fovea. Hollowing on ultrasound. Halo because of RP atrophy around the lesion, and absence of drusen. These are the features which are in favor of a nevus. Now, nevi melanoma can be very small. Like this patient looks as if he has a nevus. He doesn't have any features of a melanoma, but on follow, he did have a much larger lesion. So when you have a doubt, then you should be very closely observing the patient and not let the patient lose like this, where a patient can come with a much larger melanoma than he began with. A patient where there is orange pigmentation here became much larger later. So these are the patients where treatment has to be done very aggressively and early. Now, if you have any doubt at all about a particular small lesion being a nevus or a melanoma, again you do OCT and you find fluid and also shaggy photoreceptors, which is typical of a melanoma as opposed to a nevus. Shaggy photoreceptors again you find here in a small melanoma, which is very typical of a melanoma as opposed to a nevus. And you can of course do fluorescein angiography and ICG angiography. You find in a larger lesion, you can find double circulation, but not always typical. And also in OCTA, you find mid-macular ischemia even before therapy, and a larger FAZ and reduced capillary density in a patient who has a melanoma. So these are multimodal imaging features of melanoma. Now what about fine needle aspiration biopsy? You really don't have to do it to diagnose it because the diagnosis is fairly obvious unless it's an amelanotic lesion. But for genetic analysis purposes, you can do an FNAC. That is being done by many groups in the West where genetic test has become almost a routine. But they do it either Pastina or transcleral and apply a plaque immediately thereafter. So this is a reliable method of acquiring tumor cells for genetic analysis. Now, what about the management? Observation is definitely not the thing to do. You have to treat these patients, and treatment depends on the size, location, and the visual potential. For convenience purposes, melanoma can be classified by COMS study as the small, medium, and large. And COMS found three results. Pre-enucleation EBRT found small, large melanoma has no advantage. Whether you do enucleation or brachytherapy for medial melanoma, the systemic metastasis is comparable. So there is no real difference whether you want to enucleate or conserve the eye. So brachytherapy is more preferred for medium-sized melanomas. And for small melanoma, COMS said observation is possible, but it is not acceptable now because of what Kivela found in his very classic article, that the melanoma metastasizes when it is about 2 millimeter in thickness. And this is also elicited in the Shields paper where thickness more than 2 millimeter at a higher risk for metastasis. So even if it's a small tumor, you have to very aggressively treat it, and there is no role for observation at all. All these patients with small and medium melanomas have died from metastatic melanoma, although they don't have any locally recurrent tumor. This was the Kivela article that we are talking about, where you find argument to treat a small lesion. In fact, he showed that metastasis occurs from tumors which are 3 millimeter in diameter and 1.5 millimeter in thickness. So any small pigmented choroidal lesion which has features of a melanoma must be treated very aggressively. Smaller lesions can be treated with transpipillary thermotherapy, which works very well, but depending on the location, if there is any visual morbidity with TTT, then you may opt in favor of plaque brachytherapy. The dose of plaque is very high, 10,000 centigrade, does cause radiation retinopathy, etc. But then there are now prophylactic measures for radiation retinopathy. You can use them to reduce the incidence of radiation retinopathy. Tumor control itself is very impressive, of about 80 to 90%. For juxtapapillary lesion, we can use notch plaque like this. Notch plaque sits right next to the optic nerve, and this is one example of mild radiation retinopathy for a mid-peripheral lesion. And you can see nice regression here, amelanotic melanoma showing regression, and that's a much larger melanoma showing almost a flat scar. It's a juxtapapillary melanoma showing regression, but you can see as a consequence of treatment there is inferior optic atrophy which cannot be avoided. Proton beam radiation is currently available in India, and it is very useful but very expensive. The only advantage of proton beam is a much lower complication as opposed to plaque brachytherapy, and you can use it to treat larger tumors. For localized lesions which are taller but have a smaller base footprint, you can do sclerouvectomy, but the risk of recurrence is always there. So whenever you do sclerouvectomy, you also have to treat the base with plaque brachytherapy. Enucleation is definitely for much larger tumors. Talking a bit about diffuse melanoma, this is a placoid melanoma which has very minimal thickness but is very extensive, and that's more common in patients who have oculocutaneous melanocytosis. Patients like this, where there is episcleral pigmentation and palatine pigmentation or hairline pigmentation and fundus looking disproportionately darker, should be under follow-up because at some point in time they may develop a melanoma. This hollowing that you see there is a feature that this patient has developed a melanoma. And on enucleation, you find extensive pigmentation of the back of the sclera, it's ocular melanocytosis, and diffuse melanoma that this patient has developed over a period of time. The future lies in prognostication. Now we understand that there are two types of melanomas, class 1 and class 2. Wherever there is chromosome 3 loss, 18q gain, 1p loss, and 6q loss, it's classified as class 1 with poor prognosis. And these patients are currently being randomized for adjuvant therapy with various protocols. The results are not yet out. There is possible benefit with adjuvant treatment, but the extent of benefit and the cost benefit and also complications that arise out of these protocols are yet to be evaluated in detail. These are the protocols that are available. Some of them are still recruiting, some of them have finished recruitment, and some of them are under analysis. So that's it about melanomas. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The talk was very informative. The first question that we have is how to differentiate amelanotic choroidal melanoma from other choroidal lesion. That's a talk in itself, but I think in brief, if you can just explain.
Well, you go by, when you want to know the character of a person, what is friends, right? So accompanying features actually mean a lot. Even if it's amelanotic, there would be other accompanying features such as orange pigment or lipofuscin is a component of even amelanotic melanoma, and the presence of subretinal fluid. So amelanotic melanomas can have features of melanoma, but they don't have pigmentation. That is the only issue. So if you still have any doubt, then you look for diagnosis by other means such as imaging, which gives you a lot of clue. For example, the melanoma imaging is different from a lymphoma imaging, and lymphoma imaging is different from imaging that you see in metastasis. So putting in everything together, so presence of accessory features, the extent of subretinal fluid. For example, if it's a metastasis from a GI malignancy, then SRF will be disproportionately much larger. And if it's a lymphoma, choroidal lymphoma, then there may not be any SRF at all. If it's melanoma, then you find modest amount of subretinal fluid. So depending on the lesion and the accompanying features, you will be able to come to a clinical conclusion. And of course, PET scan helps. If there is a patient who where you suspect melanoma versus metastasis, then PET scan, if it's a primary lesion that's found somewhere else in the body, then that is a metastasis. You still have doubt, you can do an FNAC and confirm the diagnosis. Because was that reasonable? You have much better experience in this area, maybe you can go.
I think it was very good. The only thing in our setting, we see a lot more subretinal abscesses, which is amelanotic. So again, the clue there is look at the vitreous, look at the overlying vessels. Again, like sir said, image other parts. You may find evidence of quantiferon test, simple BCG testing. All that can help.
One question I have. 17 years back, in early days of my full-plastic practice, I have one cases. Even melanoma, diagnosis, and enucleation done 17 years back. Within 1 year, patient died from liver metastasis. At that time, liver metastasis at that time, within 1 year. Young energetic boy, man, 35 years. So, evaluation of the patient, system evaluation is very important, I think. Correct. Once it's diagnosed, we send the patient for internist or medicine specialist for evaluation, as well as then we prefer CT, a PET scan or whole body MRI, see metastasis.
Yeah, PET scan is preferred. It is more sensitive and specific. Currently, it is the preferred modality. Short of PET scan, you can simply do ultrasound abdomen and liver function test, etc., chest X-ray, but those have very low sensitivity and specificity. So PET is very, reasonably inexpensive now. It is not as expensive as we began with. So PET is the standard of care for screening a patient for initial screening for metastasis, and after that you can do an annual PET as a routine. Because melanoma has micrometastasis. Even if is cured, for example, you have done enucleation. After enucleation, there is no tumor left in the eye, or after plaque brachytherapy, there is nothing left in the eye. Still, after 5, 10, 15 years, patients can develop metastasis. That's because micrometastasis is already taken place even before you have diagnosed or managed the tumor. So that is the reason why.
Not audible.
Not audible. That is the reason why you should do systemic evaluation in these patients.
Yes. 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 Thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So we move on into the next talk, and the next speaker is Dr. Vikas Menon. Dr. Vikas completed his basic medical education from Government Medical College, Amritsar. He did his post-graduation, that is DNT in ophthalmology from Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi, and subsequently a fellowship in ophthalmic plastic surgery, orbital surgery, and orbital oncology from Ravi Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. At the present moment, he is a senior consultant in the Department of Ophthalmic Plastic Surgery and Oncology Services at the Center of Sight, New Delhi, for the last 12 years. He has extensive experience in the management of all kinds of ocular tumors, and he's going to talk to us about pediatric ocular tumors. Over to you, Vikas.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Midi, Dr. Haider, for conducting this program and having me here. So, my slides visible? Okay. So, I'll be talking about pediatric ocular tumors. Now, when we talk about orbital tumors, that itself is a very vast topic, and when we are talking about pediatric orbital tumors, we must understand that there are some unique challenges when we talk about orbital tumors in children. Number one is that the patient that you are dealing here with is not very cooperative compared to an adult patient with a similar orbital tumor. Number two, the emotions are running high in the family. The parents in the family are very much concerned listening at the word tumor or cancer when it comes to their child, and it is very natural. So, apart from being a clinician, you also need to give them appropriate counseling, maybe act as their counselor and provide them psychological support at the same time. That is very important. Number three, all investigations and interventions are going to require general anesthesia. So whatever you decide, whatever you think about this problem, you need to be very precise in whatever investigation you are ordering. So you cannot be, running around asking for CT scan first, then asking for MRI, then asking for ultrasound. So whatever needs to be done, you need to have a very clear plan in your mind, because everything is going to require a general anesthesia in small children. You need to be very sure in your mind as to what investigation would be most appropriate in a given setting. And then there are certain conditions which are unique to pediatric age group, and you should be able to identify them and plan your management accordingly. History taking is absolutely essential when you look at a kid with a proptosis or an orbital suspected orbital tumor. The age at onset is the most basic and most important question, and that will tell you whether what you're dealing with is a congenital problem or an acquired problem. And then ask about the duration and the pace of evolution. That itself will tell you a lot about what you're dealing with. A very rapidly increasing pathology could be infection or inflammation or a rapidly aggressive tumor, whereas a stationary kind of a mass which you see there would be a structural anomaly. Any familial genetic condition. So this is something which you will have to put a leading question to the family in case you have a pathology which you suspect that could be associated with something like a syndrome, maybe neurofibromatosis. So this is something which you should have in your mind and ask history in the family. Examination would be, for any kid, would be similar to what you have for routine proptosis cases, but I'll not go into the detail. It's a crowded slide, but two things. One is because there are certain conditions which, as I said, are more common in children. So don't forget to look at their fundus. Sometimes, as an oculoplastic surgeon or an optical surgeon, people do tend to look at external aspects and not look at the retina in detail. But here, in certain situations where you may have a leukemic involvement of the orbit, you may just find rod spots on the retina or inflammatory or leukemic cells in the AC. That itself may give you a clue about the diagnosis. So do a proper complete examination is all I want to say. Secondly, if you have a suspecting a metastasis, do palpate the abdomen, and many a time, if you are able to palpate an abdominal mass, your diagnosis itself is made in the OPD on the first visit itself, and the subsequent investigations are only done to confirm what you suspect. Imaging, what you need to plan is very important, and depending upon the kind of pathology you are dealing with, you need to have a clear picture in your mind again. MRI, wherever feasible, wherever affordable and available, is the preferred imaging modality in children. However, if it's a bony lesion or a bony erosion that you are suspecting in a particular condition, then obviously CT scan would be better. If a patient is not affording or the MRI is a problem, then CT scan, nowadays we have spiral CT scans which are very fast and they have low radiation protocols. Even they are good enough and can give you significantly more information compared to the earlier generation CT. USG is mainly reserved nowadays for differentiating between cystic and solid lesions of the orbit and have a limited role. Find the tumor mimics, and the important task here is you should be able to differentiate infections, inflammations from tumors. Sometimes we have seen long-standing foreign bodies in the orbit with a lot of inflammation surrounding them, which come and they also sometimes can mimic a mass or a tumor of the orbit. So elicit a proper history of trauma or a foreign body, especially when it comes to a child. Moving on to the topic itself, pediatric orbital tumors, as with all tumors, can be either benign or malignant. Benign lesions most commonly are structural lesions in almost 50% of orbital benign tumors. Then there can be neurogenic tumors, vascular lesions, bony lesions, and histiocytic lesions. I'll just take you through a few clinical examples of how these cases present. Benign cystic lesion, the most common one is dermoid, which I'm sure almost all of us would have encountered at some point of time in our practices. And this is about 50% of all pediatric orbital lesions. It can be superficial. In that case, it can be either at the medial part of the medial part of orbit or the supratemporal part of the orbit, where we call them as angular dermoids, a medial angular or an external angular dermoid. Or it can be a deep-seated lesion, and in such deep dermoids, usually the diagnosis is not made or the clinical manifestation won't present till late. So the patient may come to you in teenage years or even later, when he develops proptosis due to gradual enlargement of the dermoid system. Another variant, which is fortunately less common, is the tumble variant of the dermoid, whereby you have one component or one part of the dermoid in the orbit and another component is breaking through the bone and lateral orbital wall and going into the temporalis fossa. Here, important thing is you need to take out the entire dermoid and not leave behind any of the part. You may have to enlarge the bony ostium around the dermoid and take it out in its entirety. Management remains almost what it was earlier. For the last many years, surgical excision is the preferred modality to treat these dermoids. The only thing that probably has changed is our incisions. Our incisions have become more aesthetic nowadays, and instead of giving an incision directly over the dermoid, we realized that we can take out the dermoid even with a small incision, which is hidden maybe in the eyelid crease or one of the natural creases, so that the patients nowadays go back with very minimal scarring. The next common benign orbital tumor I would like to come to is neurogenic tumors. Now, this 4-year-old child presented with an actual proptosis of the left eye associated with diminution of vision and an RAPD. When an MRI was done, it showed a spindle-shaped fusiform kind of a mass, which is actually arising from the optic nerve. You can see that the optic nerve substance itself here seems to be thickened. The sheath is obviously thickened, but the substance of the optic nerve is involved. So this, no doubt, here is an optic nerve glioma. What is important about optic nerve gliomas is that they can have a variable rate of progression, maybe rapidly progressing in some cases, whereas in others it may be growing very slowly or almost static. And when it grows, it can grow towards the optic chiasma, as seen in this situation here. And in these cases, you need to monitor the other eye function as well. So, in earlier days, radiation or surgical excision used to be the main modality of treatment, but what has changed over the recent years is the primary treatment modality has become chemotherapy. And these tumors respond well to chemotherapy, although the visual prognosis remains poor still. In those cases, do not respond to chemotherapy, still the option of radiation or surgery is used, but now relatively very rarely. Another common tumor, benign tumor, which we see in our clinics, which arises from peripheral orbital nerves, is glioblastoma. Now, the diagnosis in most of these cases is quite obvious, as the lesion you see right there in front of you, you can touch the tumor itself and you get a classic bag of worms feel, which is because of the thickened nerves, which are the main part of this tumor. And the problem here is that the tumor keeps growing until late teens. So, and it also causes significant risk of amblyopia. So you have few challenges at hand. You need to take out the tumor so that the child comes out of an embryogenic situation. So what we do is what we learned in our fellowship, still which is the technique that is the same thing which is practiced now also, is the template technique. The template technique, what we do is we mark out the normal lid measurements, the lid crease to lid margin and the lid crease to the eyebrow, and then take out whatever redundant tissue is there in the eyelid. And basically, it's a debulking surgery. You cannot take out the entire tumor ever. And sometimes these patients do require more than one surgery because the tumor keeps coming back till the child is growing. So this is the same patient after one surgery, and after a couple of years and after a couple of more surgeries, this is how he is now. Capillary hemangiomas are other common tumors of the orbit and eyelids, and the good thing is again they are very obvious and easy to diagnose when they are present anteriorly, but they can also have a deep component behind the septum, in which case it becomes a little difficult to diagnose them. The treatment again has changed in this problem from intralesional injections of steroid that we used to do earlier to oral propranolol, and there is enough evidence to support the use of oral propranolol for these things. Next is venolymphatic malformations. Again, what we used to call them as lymphangiomas, and earlier, about 10 years back, we used to, or maybe even later than that, we used to excise or debulk most of these cysts and debulk the tumor. But now, again, we have shifted to a minimally invasive technique of sclerotherapy. We use bleomycin, and the bleomycin injections are given intralesionally, and this is the patient after a couple of bleomycin injections. Results are usually very good. When there are venous malformations like these in an elderly child, you can ask the child to perform Valsalva or do a bending forward test to see if the blood vessels are filling up. And this is a venous malformation with a deeper communication, also known as varices. And sometimes you have complex AV malformations, which are also high flow malformations, where you can hear a bloom or a thrill on the tumor. So in these cases, the management is relatively difficult and usually requires the assistance of an interventional neuroradiologist, whereby you do a glue map excision of these malformations. The next set of benign tumors are osseous lesions. There is a set of problems which may arise from the bone. So it can be fibrous dysplasia, aneurysmal bone cyst, osteomas, and these can all lead to orbital asymmetry. Now, this young man presented to us with superior displacement of both the eyes and fullness around the maxillary sinus. So when a CT scan was done, this is what was seen. What you see here is the bone which has got lysed, and there is sort of a fibrous tissue which is filling up the maxillary sinus and the inferior and encroaching on the inferior part of the orbit. So this was a case of fibrous dysplasia. Here, because of some unknown factors, there is fibrous tissue which starts multiplying, and it's filled with immature bone cells as well. It causes mechanical distortion of the orbital contents. The globe is pushed up, and if it arises from the sphenoid bone, then you can have a situation where it can even lead to compromise of the optic nerve and visual functions are compromised. Treatment involves an aggressive or an extensive debulking surgery, which has to be taken up in association with plastic surgeon or an ENT surgeon along with. Again, this child presented with proptosis and a mass in the superior orbit and the superior and lateral part of orbit. And what you see here is something like maybe a mass with a cystic kind of a cavity in between. So this was basically a type of a histiocytic lesion, also known as eosinophilic granulomas. These are benign lesions most of the times, can be unifocal or multifocal, and can be malignant in some rare situations. Moving on to the malignant orbital tumors. Malignant orbital tumors, most commonly that we need to know about are, and we should not miss these tumors, are rhabdomyosarcoma, which is the most common malignant tumor of the orbit, primary, and then leukemias, lymphomas, metastasis, and secondary invasion of the orbit by a malignancy of adjacent tissues. Some less common tumors are listed here, but I'll be focusing on the more common ones. Now this child, again a 4-year-old child, presented with an infiromedial orbital mass, the globe pushed upwards, and so this was the MRI of the patient, where you can see a very well enhancing mass which was going deep into the posterior part of the orbit right up to the apex infiromedially. Fortunately, it was amenable to complete excision and the whole thing was taken out, and on histopathology it turned out to be rhabdomyosarcoma. Now in rhabdomyosarcomas, there have been a number of studies which have been done to improve prognosis. These are called intergroup rhabdomyosarcoma studies, and study number 1, 2, 3, 4. Currently what we follow is IRS 5 study, and according to that, we need to supplement surgery of these patients with adjuvant chemotherapy and radiation. So this is the same patient after 6 months now, and he's received chemotherapy as well as radiation and is doing well. So this form of multimodal therapy is unique for not unique for orbital tumors, but is practiced in most of the other tumors of the body. But for orbit, we use it in specific conditions depending upon the type of tumor and the extent of the tumor. The second most common malignant tumor of the orbit is granulocytic sarcoma. Now, granulocytic sarcoma is basically a manifestation of leukemia in the orbit. Now, AML is the most common type of leukemia which affects the orbit, and there are certain genetic subtypes of it which carry good prognosis. Now, this was a child who was presented with bilateral orbital masses. The peripheral smear was normal in this situation. Sometimes you get an abnormality or blast cells just in the peripheral smear and you don't need to do a biopsy. But in certain situations, the peripheral smear may be normal and you have to resort to biopsy. So this was one such situation where biopsy proved AML, and he had the favorable genetic composition, and he was started on chemotherapy, on which he improved a lot. He responded very well. You can see in the second image that the mass is almost gone. The bilateral masses, they are both almost resolved. But unfortunately, the child could not survive. The disease came back after some years, and the child succumbed to the disease. These are really tumors, I would say, with bad prognosis. So, and sometimes you have a situation where the orbital part presents first, and the systemic leukemia comes after a few months. So, if you are able to diagnose these children when they are just at the stage of an orbital manifestation and don't have systemic manifestations yet, in those cases, definitely the prognosis can be slightly better compared to a child who already has a systemic manifestation, full-blown leukemia. Last metastatic malignancy to the orbit, I would say, is neuroblastoma, which is worthwhile recognizing. And it's a tumor which arises from primitive neuroblast cells, which are destined to become part of autonomic nervous system. And so the tumor may lie somewhere in the chest, neck, or abdomen as a mass and can even be palpable if it's there in the abdomen and large enough. It is known to throw metastasis to the orbit. Can be unilateral, but in about 40% it can be a bilateral throw as well. And these cases typically have this look of periocular ecchymosis and hemorrhages. Along with they also have a very sick looking appearance, and because it's already a stage 4 disease when they people do. Then the last part is the orbital malignancies, which are not primarily orbital but rather come from the adjacent structures, either from sinuses or, as in this situation, a retinoblastoma which has gone bad. And this is a totally preventable situation, as we saw in Dr. Virus's talk. If treated and diagnosed well in time, there is no need for any child these days to progress to this bad situation, where obviously the prognosis for life is not so good. So my take-home message would be, prognosis in children, it could be a manifestation of an underlying grave disorder, so it should never be ignored. One should avoid the urge to start an empirical treatment, start some antibiotics and steroids, and let us see what happens. Now, that kind of approach would not help, and it is, I would suggest strongly against it. And one must not shy from taking help if one is not sure of what one is dealing with. And one must avoid any delay in referral for treatment of these conditions, as some of them may be deadly and fatal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Very nice take-home messages from your talk. I think Dr. Haider had a question. He raised his hand.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Haider, do you have a question for Dr. Menon? So there is a question from the audience. Do you inject bleomycin under ultrasound guidance or CT guidance?
You can do it under ultrasound guidance or CT guidance as well. But if it's an anterior cyst and if it's a macro cyst which you can even palpate, sometimes you can do without that also. But ideally, it should be either ultrasound guided or CT guided.
Do you need an interventional radiologist to do embolization?
Yes. For arteriovenous malformations, which have got a deeper communication, yes, you do need an interventional radiologist.
Do you leave a catheter to drain the lymphangioma, especially in the orbital type?
See, when we were doing surgeries, then obviously there were more incidences of hemorrhages happening secondarily, but with sclerotherapy, there's hardly any hemorrhage. You just give a tight pressure patch for 1 day or 1 night, and the next day you can open it. There's no need to put a drain in for sclerotherapy.
And how do you treat multicystic orbital lymphangioma?
Again, multicystic lymphangiomas, you can inject in various places. You can go into the cyst, aspirate them, and you can inject bleomycin there. So far, we've only tried it in extraconal cysts, but not gone into the intraconal space. There are 1 or 2 cases which have been, which some people have mentioned. I could not find them published though, but in some of the conferences, people talk about 1 or 2 cases losing vision. I don't know what's the cause, whether it's the sclerosant or is it something else. We're really not sure about that, but whatever, we are still confining ourselves to the not to the intraconal space, but to the extraconal space. And you can give multiple injections in different sites.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we come to the last talk of the session of the webinar that is going to be given by Dr. Seema Das, who is a consultant and head of the department at Dr. Shroff's Charity